So something pretty interesting just happened. Canada's Prime Minister took a 4-day trip to China, and it's got a lot of people talking. Was this just another trade mission, or are we actually seeing the first real crack in the old world order? Let's get into it. The source for this explainer, Faisal Warrach, kicks things off with this quote, and it really sets the stage. When the enemy is making a mistake, he should never be disturbed. It kind of makes you think, right, that maybe some countries are playing the long game, just watching their rivals stumble. Okay, so what kicked all of this off? It was this visit to China by Canada's Prime Minister, and it was the first time a Canadian leader had been there in 8 years. But it wasn't the trip itself that really turned heads. It was just 3 little words. Picture this. He's standing right there next to President Xi Jinping in Beijing, and he says their partnership serves well for the new world order. Now, our source calls this a bombshell. And the interpretation? It's basically a declaration that Canada and China are ready to write a new playbook for global business, one that doesn't necessarily need the West to lead.
So 8,800 kilometers. Why does that number matter? Well, that's the length of the border between Canada and the United States. Think about that. For America's biggest neighbor, literally sharing the longest undefended border in the world, to publicly side with its main strategic rival, according to this analysis, that's a huge deal.
So you have to ask, what would push a country like Canada to make a move this bold? Well, our source points the finger directly at recent U.S. policies, specifically using tariffs against its own allies. And you can really see the contrast here. It's like a tale of 2 completely different strategies. On one side, you have the U.S. getting into trade disputes with its friends, and on the other, you've got Canada and China doing the exact opposite. They're making deals and tearing down trade barriers between them. And this isn't just talk. Here's a perfect example. China had this absolutely massive 84% tariff on Canadian canola oil. But after this new deal, boom, it slashed all the way down to just 15%. That's real money, and it's the kind of thing that solidifies a new partnership. But this story doesn't stop in North America. Oh no. The Canadian Prime Minister then took his message over to Europe, and he used this really powerful analogy from an old Czech book to talk about Europe's relationship with the US. He told this story about a greengrocer who was forced to put a political sign in his window that he didn't believe in. Everybody in town knew it was a lie, but they all played along to stay out of trouble. The source says the system's power was built on that pretense. So the Prime Minister's message to Europe was simple. Maybe it's time to just take down the sign, to stop quietly obeying. Okay, so that raises a pretty big question. If countries are actually ready to take down the sign, what kind of firepower do they have? What are their economic weapons? Well, Europe has something they call a trade bazooka. It's a tool that would let the entire EU basically close its doors to any country that tries to bully it with economic pressure. But here's the kicker. Our source points out that this weapon was originally designed with China in mind. Now they're talking about using it against the United States. And that brings us to the so-called nuclear option of economic warfare, U.S. debt. Countries like China and Japan hold trillions of dollars in U.S. Treasury bonds. So the question is, could they actually use that to bring the American economy to its knees? The theory itself is pretty straightforward. If a country, or a few of them together, suddenly started selling off all their U.S. bonds, it would just flood the market. The dollar's value could crash, interest rates would skyrocket, and it could, in theory, cause the U.S. to default. Total chaos. But, and this is a big but, here's the catch. The source explains that this is basically a weapon of mutually assured destruction. If you start dumping all your bonds, the first thing that happens is that the value of the bonds you still hold plummets. You'd be causing massive damage to your own bank account long before the U.S. really felt the heat. So the takeaway is, it's not a weapon you can just use on a whim. Now, to really get what's happening today, the source argues we need to zoom out, way out, and look at the United States not just as a country, but as a classic empire that's always been driven by a search for more security. And if you look back, you can see this pattern stretching for centuries, from the very first settlements fighting for their borders, to expanding across the continent in the 1800s, to taking islands in the 1900s. Our source frames the recent talk about Greenland and even possible future interest in Iceland as just the latest chapter in the exact same story. Expand to feel secure. And this quote from our source just perfectly sums up that whole idea. The security of an empire does not end until the empire itself ends. What he's saying is that for an empire, the job is never done. There's no final border. The push to expand is just part of its DNA, and it only stops when the empire itself is no more. So this all leads us to the final and kind of philosophical part of this analysis. It's about power, it's about justice, and how history seems to repeat itself in some pretty brutal ways. Apparently, European leaders are bringing up this ancient Greek story called the Melian Dialogue. In it, the super-powerful Athenian Empire shows up at the tiny island of Melos and gives them a choice. Join us or we will destroy you. Melos argues for what's right, for justice, and Athens completely annihilates them, saying the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. A tough lesson. But our source throws a real curveball here, pointing out what they see as some serious hypocrisy. The argument is that while European leaders might feel like the weak little island of Melos now when dealing with the US, they were more than happy to play the role of the powerful Athenian general in places like Gaza and Libya not so long ago. And that's what we're left with, this big, final question. If history really is like a giant wheel, always turning, with empires rising and falling and new ones taking their place, are we just watching it begin to turn once more? It's a fascinating thing to think about,